Today, when is a bear not a bear? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined again by Tony Lecantro. Hello, Tony.
Evening, Martin. Good to be back.
Indeed, yeah. Can you believe it? A new year and everything looks the same.
It's the same rosy outlook we've been saying for some time.
So I know that you've been doing quite a lot of work on what is a fair price for property in Sydney. So I think it will be a really good place to explore, but you might also want to just segue into some of your own experiences around the property market recently, which I gather has been a little bumpy.
It's been terrible. I started researching in Perth for a few months to find somewhere to live. It would be a change of a relationship for me. I do have some kids. I found this house in Balcatta, which was been giving away. It was a giveaway. So I've actually revealed where that house is. And I had a chuckle, Martin, because when I said it was 7.8 kilometres from Trig Beach, people actually were trying to work out where it was. So what happened was Commonwealth Bank said, we want 20%. I could have come up with the cash eventually, maybe, I don't know. I had some shares, but I then went through a non-bank lender, which I won't mention because I don't have to. And they said, well, we need 2 tax returns. So I'm the worst person with tax returns. I've never been ahead of my life. So I put them in. And what slowed the whole process was the ATO getting me a notice of assessment. So that basically I missed out on the finance period. I'd need some Benny Hill music for viewers to say what happened, why I didn't get this house. But happy to reveal it and proud to have found a good buy. My life probably takes a different course now. So I live in Perth's best suburb. It's either Mount Hawthorn, Leederville or Yokine. I'm considering rent vesting, actually, to be honest.
Right.
I have had an opportunity come up for somewhere quite nice to rent. I am looking at the yield on my place. Look, I still think Perth's a great place to buy. If I was a family, based on what's around, I'd certainly be buying. But a few Benny Hill incidents saw that I didn't get this house. But that's life.
It is life, and particularly when it's property related. And of course, the rental yields in Perth are actually still declining.
Yeah, they are. I looked at this place and I came up with 5.5% gross. I think there's a lot of window dressing when it comes to yield because you've got rates, cost of repairs, but it was a 9-year-old house, so there wouldn't be too much that could go wrong with it the short term. But yeah, around 5 to 5.5% is my target. But historically, that's still pretty poor, but people in Sydney are doing it on 2.
So does that include the capital gains, or is that just on a cash flow basis?
Just on a cash flow basis.
Yeah, okay. Well then, if you did get a 5 to 5.5, you would be in about the 5% of the total population of investors across Australia.
Which is insane. And what drove me to this house was the kitchen was a little bit too small, but if I would have spent 30, 40 grand maybe on the kitchen, it was a $700,000 house for $600,000. So that's where I saw the bargain. I know the area. I've done the research. A lot of people say, well, Perth's still got some room to fall. For sure it does, maybe 5-10%. But if you can find something like that, you're insulated.
Sure. Well, and of course, if you're riding it for the long term, the hope is eventually it will begin to come up again. And of course, if you follow the real estate industry, they keep saying it's next month. It's just that the next month keeps moving out.
It was an interesting point. Someone I know has some land out near Henley Brook. Now, Brabham, for those unaware, is Perth's most highly performed suburb. Brabham's like a Jordan Springs or a Ropes Crossing, which is scary stuff, but they're trying to buy land around there. So that area is 30 k's from the CBD. And what I'm seeing is if these developers are going to buy up, you're going to see the creation of an outer Perth, similar to what happened in outer Western Sydney. So interesting times.
Okay, well, we'll see how that plays out, I guess, over the next 2 or 3 years. But just going back to my sort of rental yield thing, right? I actually do have data across the whole of Australia on gross and net rental yield. So I look at net rental yield, which is the difference between essentially the money coming in, the money going out on repairs and maintenance, and also the mortgage repayments, right? So that net rental is the critical one.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that more than half of people in Melbourne and Sydney are underwater. So they're actually net negative on a cash flow basis at the moment. That's continuing to rise. It's a little bit better if you look in Queensland. Canberra's, all right, but there's still quite a few people who are also underwater. But then if you go to the smaller markets like South Australia or Tasmania, the returns are a little better, and Perth's a little better as well. But if you think of it as 60% of the market is in two major centres, right, the bulk of people there are well below the 5%. Most of them are in the 2 and a bit percent or below, and half of them are losing money week in, week out, month in, month out, which is why so many property investors are now getting very twitchy and are now thinking of selling. So I've had a lot of information coming through in my surveys that basically says in the next 3 months, we're going to see a huge flood of properties coming onto the market as property investors try to get out before prices slide further. So interesting times. So with that sort of introduction, let's talk about Sydney, because I know that you've done some work specifically on the Sydney market, and the average is what at the moment the average mean, or the median would be what 900,000 or above. Is that right?
Yeah, it depends what figures you use. Some of them, the last one I saw was about 935.
Yeah.
But the peak was 1.157.
Yeah. Yeah, just over the million. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, which is ridiculous. So I had a look at it, and interestingly, when I was looking at the island property bubble, I quite enjoyed Morgan Kelly's research. And he said that in all these OECD corrections, you lose 70% of your gains. So let's round it down, 600 to 1.2. So there you can take $480,000 off those gains for starters. And that takes us to a situation where we're still hideously overvalued, and there's a lot to be assessed. So, and people might say, well, you live in Perth, what idea do you have? Well, for a few years of my police career, I was a free-range cop. So I got to cover pretty much all of Sydney, mainly on the transport networks, got to know all the areas. I lived and worked in Bondi. I remind viewers that in 1993, I actually bought a unit in Bondi on 2.4 times my shitty police salary. And I could walk to work, and life was good. And the only difference then was Bondi was relatively uncrowded.
Right.
So I take a whole encompassing view of Sydney, and I do have a little bit of knowledge on it.
Yeah, but your calculation then would be that's about 640 or something would be if you applied that rule of logic to it, right? But 640 would still be horribly over the typical loan to income ratio that you would expect to see in a sort of a normal market, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that still says that even at that level, people are going to struggle. The other point, of course, is that the other way to come at this is to say, well, what is the right ratios? In other words, how do you get back to the right ratios? And there you'd have to see a drop of at least 40% to be able to actually come anywhere close. But again, you'd still be over on the loan to income ratio. And that's why, of course, in Sydney and indeed in Melbourne, many people can only buy with two incomes, preferably full-time incomes. Which, of course, then puts a lot of pressure on the whole family finance situation. So, I mean, we are so far off the norm and so far out of kilter that people, it's hard for people to get their head around. And, of course, a lot of people say, oh, well, it's a unique situation. Interest rates are really low. Therefore, from an affordability standpoint, it's not a big deal. To which I reply, well, just look at the cash flow that I'm seeing through my surveys. A lot of people are really struggling at the moment. And even if you were to come back to the sort of the 640 median level, that doesn't solve the problem. So we have a huge, huge problem in Sydney and Melbourne.
Well, what I did, Martin, I actually allowed for some wage inflation. So so now the median wage is 85,000. I actually allowed it to go to 90. Heaven forbid how we're going to see that. And you're still on 7 times price to income to live in a congested overpriced, ugly place. So, look, and it's ridiculous. It makes me sad that young families are forced out to live at Ropes Crossing, Jordan Springs, and they're still paying $700,000 to $800,000 to sign their life away on a place that is never going to see what they paid for it, to commute all that time. It's just not worth it.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing now price falls of 20 to 25% now in those urban outer rings, and places like Campbelltown and Liverpool. Not every place, but a lot of places. And so I'm looking at those first-time buyers who were bribed into the market 18 months to 2 years ago, buying absolutely at the top, and as you're paying 700 or more, right? And they've already now seen that drop by 20 to 25%, right? And guess what? They put in a 15 to 20% deposit. So that means that they're now sitting on negative equity, even now.
Which is
right?
their parents' money. Because let's face it, how many young couples on an average wage can save $150,000 minimum? It's absolute rubbish. And they probably borrowed it from multiple places, and wouldn't be surprising if an honest mortgage broker filled out the gift column.
Well, maybe. I mean, what's interesting is, again, from my surveys, more than half of first-time buyers who got in over the last 18 months got help from the bank and mum and dad. Yep. The average contribution was $85,000, $86,000, but quite a lot were higher than that. And essentially what mum and dad were doing was raiding the equity in their property, passing it down the generation to allow the next generation to get into the market. But, of course, they bought in right at the top. So firstly, now that first-time buyer is now sitting on a negative equity pool. But the other point is that older couple, the mum and dad who actually raided the equity, they're seeing their value fall as well now. So essentially they thought they had plenty of leeway, thinking about retirement and all of those things. And suddenly they're also now seeing their prices falling. So it's a double whammy, basically. You've got the first-time buyer struggling. You've got the older family now also struggling. So this intergenerational shift of wealth is really quite concerning. And I'm seeing it again and again and again across my surveys. And this whole question of negative equity and what's really going on, no one's talking about it yet.
No, and I think equity is probably going to be the word of this year or next. And when I was in Dublin in 2010, I cop a lot of crap from people saying that the Irish are different, we're different. Okay, well they had a housing market that halved. I mean, I don't see how the banks are that different. However, it's scary that that people are going to be mortgage prisoners. And on the front page of the Dublin newspapers, it's all about equity. And that was 2010 after the Celtic Tigers. I think we've got years of pain ahead. And as I said last time, when you see the headline, property will never recover, on the front page of the Telegraph, it's probably time to buy. But till then, there's a lot of pain ahead.
Yeah, well, the negative equity thing is really interesting, right? Because on one hand, providing you can continue to service the loan, it's a paper problem, right? Because no one's going to come knocking on your door to say, give me some more money, right? But there are two things to bear in mind. The first is that in a negative equity situation, particularly if prices continue to fall and then go sideways, you're going to be in that situation for a number of years. And a lot of people in the UK and in Ireland 10 years later, after the GFC, are still in negative equity now, which means you're locked in the place that you're in, unless you can find a bank who is prepared to transfer that negative equity to another property. And in the UK and in Ireland, they started to do that to try and free up the market. But that's a huge thing. The other point then is that some people then try to repay more of the loan to get the loan value down, to sort of chase the value down, which means that, of course, they've got less money to spend on anything else, so it puts more pressure on the finances. But the other factor is that you then can't necessarily refinance when you'd want to. So, there are some attractive rates around for some types of borrowers at the moment, particularly if the loan-to-value ratio is reasonable. But, of course, those mortgage prisoners, those with a negative equity, just can't get any of those really good rates. So they're sitting in a mortgage on a higher interest rate with no way out. So whichever way you look at it, it's a really, really complex situation for them, despite the fact that no one's going to come knocking. But here's the thought. Wonder whether the banks will get to the point where they start to get twitchy, right? Because they do always have the right to actually ask for an additional repayment to reduce the balance. So just because you've got a mortgage of X with a bank at the moment doesn't mean that the bank will always be prepared to give you X. They might give you X minus something, right? And that's a whole big question then about to what extent are the banks themselves reacting and responding to these lower property values or not at the moment. Because at the moment, very few of them are marking their portfolios to market, which means that they are actually sitting on paper values in their portfolios which are much higher than the real values. So you've got another issue in the banking system as well, which hasn't yet been flushed out. No. So we are in for a long, torrid time, which is one of the reasons why I keep saying I can't see any rationale for a hope that somehow magically home prices are going to start swinging up anytime soon. I still think we've got a long way to go, and I still think it's another 2 or 3 years if we're lucky, and it could be a lot longer than that.
Well, your mortgage distress figures are 31%. That is truly frightening.
Yep.
And you look at the NAB lifted their variable rates 0.12. I think the key with the big four banks is be the nasty one to go first, because everyone's going to remember the last bank that does it. So, and people say, well, the RBA is going to cut rates. Well, if you look at those unemployment figures, there's a damn good case for them to lift rates. And I think actually a 25 basis point lift would actually be better to the market than a cut, to be honest. I know that sounds weird, but that's just the way I feel.
Well, I think you're right. So I think if the RBA was to cut, then effectively the market would react saying, shit, we're in a much deeper situation than we thought we were, right? Because they sort of tend to believe what the RBA says about everything absolutely fine and there's no issues. And, whereas if there was a cut, then that would basically indicate that the RBA had got it wrong. But the fact of the matter is that the major banks are sitting on around a 50 basis point margin hit at the moment because of the international funding costs that are running through, and that's particularly if you look at LIBOR or if you look at BBSW. They haven't actually been able to claw back the bulk of that funding increase because, of course, they were hoping that it would be very temporary and then it would come back to more normal state. But I think this is a new normal now. I think those funding costs are, if anything, going to be higher. And the point to make there, it isn't just the US Fed rate that's influencing that. There's another factor at play here, which is the lack of confidence about the banking system and the banking funding system here in Australia and the way it works internationally. Because if you read the RBA figures and their recent conversations, they're trying to explain why it is that the margin is still so accelerated compared where it used to be, right? It's much wider. And the short answer is it's not directly funding, it's more to do with the level of confidence and the fact that many of the international investors are now getting twitchy, plus, of course, the fact that the bond margin return is better in the US than it is here now, which is almost unheard of. So if I'm an international investor, I can get a better return investing in the US compared with Australia. So there's another reason why funding costs are going to go up. So you put all that together and you say, well, like it or not, a lot of people are going to find that their mortgage rates are going to go up, either because the RBA moves the rate up or because of the out-of-cycle funding costs that ultimately have to be passed through. So another reason why I think households' confidence levels are whittling away. And, that mortgage stress number, that's more than 1 million households who are in mortgage stress. In other words, on a cash flow basis, they're struggling to pay all the bills and also pay the mortgage. Now, they can go on for a period of time like that, and they can go on raiding savings, and they can hunker down and put more on credit cards or go and use a payday loan or something. But eventually, this has to crystallize into something significantly more risky. And my sort of modelling is normally about 18 months to 2 years ahead of where they are. They've probably tried to refinance once or twice, but they get to the point where they've got to sell. So there's more downward pressure.
I think the key, Martin, is if you're going to panic first. And that's it. I mean, be the first to hold a garage sale. I mean, my partner took some DVDs to cash converters, and now they're offering 10 cents for them. I mean, be the first to put your crap on Gumtree. Because what's going to happen is, can you imagine if you're in a suburb and someone drops their price $50,000 to get a sale, and then suddenly the agent comes around and said, excuse me, Mr. North, the like-for-like sales are saying this is the price, and then that's it.
Yep.
So I think even though the peak of 1.157 million is now down to 930, it's still extremely expensive, and people, there's no excuse now. You've put forward your case. That segment on the Switzers program was unbelievable. I just thought you, as I said, you're too nice, Martin.
I just tell it as it is. I don't need any hyperbole. I just get on with it.
And I think that what Nikki Hartley said was concerning about the new paradigm of permanently high prices, because didn't we hear the same thing in 1929 just before the crash?
Yeah, well, I think she was arguing that it was being driven by strong migration and therefore high demand. But of course, you know and I know that there's already 1 million vacant properties across Australia. There's another 200,000 properties coming on stream from the new construction sector over the next 12 to 18 months. So we don't have an undersupply. In fact, we have too much property available now. The reason that the prices have been so high is because credit has been hugely available, and now credit is a lot tighter, and therefore prices are following it down. You know, that's the fundamental logic. And by the way, the APRA commentary today, I don't know whether you saw it, but they actually came out with a report today basically explaining and almost post-justifying the things that they did, but they basically said they have no intention of changing the parameters, in other words, loosening the lending standards. And in fact, they still think there's a lot of risk in the system even now. So that was quite an interesting comment from APRA. So what that tells me is that we're going to have tighter lending for a lot longer into the future. The lending standards are going to remain tight. And that basically means that we are not going to see home prices going to go up, and they're going to continue to come down. So I think my position of, you know, if you just take a local crisis of 20 to 30% in Sydney and Melbourne from peak to trough is probably reasonable. And of course, AMP's economist has now come out with 25% estimation. And if you take an international overlay on that, so let's say that China goes wrong, or the US goes wrong, or Brexit goes wrong, we could easily be above 40%. I mean, I think those are not actually, you know, outlandish numbers. And, you know, although I said them last August on 60 Minutes, and everybody sort of had the heebie-jeebies, now more people are sort of, coming on stream. And you might be interested to know I recorded another segment with 60 Minutes last week, where we spoke again about these same scenarios and sort of what's going on now. So that'll come out in 2 or 3 weeks, I think. So it's pretty interesting, but yeah, you're right. That what was fascinating about the Switzer thing was that it was like somebody's right and somebody's wrong, and of course everybody wants the people who said it's all going to be fine to be right, except that the data is saying, I think I'm right.
Well, it's like going to a doctor and the diagnosis is a terminal illness, and you can then try and change the narrative to say that you've got the flu. And I mean, I did a business show every 3 or 4 weeks after Peter's show in Sydney, so I did have the chance to talk to him. But I just think at the moment that it's as if everyone's ganging up on you with no solid basis, and all we're arguing is that houses are going to go from nosebleed levels to hideously expensive. What happens if housing becomes affordable again, like in the mid-90s when I could walk to work at Bondi Police Station on 45, 50 grand a year, go have a surf, go buy a deconstructed Vegemite. Actually, no, it was a Vegemite on toast. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I think Australia is going to head back. We're going to go back towards the 70s. And the unfortunate thing about the 70s, Martin, was stagflation. And now people are going to demand higher wages. There's going to be no growth, and that's inflationary.
Yeah. Well, I think, the fact is we are going to see the Reserve Bank doing QE or the equivalent, right? They're going to have to do that because essentially the GDP numbers are going to get weaker as we go forward, not least because of the household consumption dying, but also because I think that the international context is also going less good. And of course, there have been various reports over the last couple of months now on global growth slowing. And so you put all that together and the economy is not as strong as everybody, wants to believe it to be. And the other point there, of course, is that just having more job growth is not actually a sign necessarily of a good economy that's growing. It may simply be a question of more people essentially getting jobs that don't pay very well. and just spreading the jobs more widely across the market. And a lot of people in my surveys have multiple part-time jobs because that's all they can get, but they're still counted as employed. So actually, the numbers don't necessarily tell you the full story when it comes to what's happening in the employment sector.
Well, what a shit way to spend the rest of your life. I mean, I've learned so much from you, from your programs. I just like going to Woolworths and be able to throw some smoked salmon in the trolley or the occasional treat and not have to worry about this massive mortgage, negative equity. You go MasterCard payments, debt collectors. I mean, I think the big winner out of this is going to be Tammy from My Budget, because I think, you know, they should be taking a preemptive strike. I mean, personal bankruptcies are about to go through the roof. I think there's going to be a lot of social issues, a lot of men working one job, two jobs. You've got all these rideshare drivers running the Uber and Ola app at the same time. There's just not enough jobs to go around, and there's not enough pizza delivery jobs as well. I just think Australia is turning to shit, and we've got to go full circle. Let's get back to where one wage you can buy a house where you need to live. Kids can go out and play. I just think society's just become caught up in this stupid greed, and we're a sadder place for it.
Well, I agree with that. And the fact of the matter is, though, the journey to get there will be extremely uncomfortable. Remember, of course, that quite a lot of the superannuation funds that people have their savings in are actually intrinsically connected to the finance sector and to the property sector. So people have sort of, when I speak to them, quite often assume that the superannuation sector is somewhat insulated from that, but actually that's going to be hit too. So effectively, if we do have these sort of corrections that we're talking about, it really does touch every facet of household finances, including the superannuation and the mortgage and everything else. So I think we're in for a really uncomfortable ride, but you know, the alternative is simply to try and stoke the debt bomb even more and kick the can down the road a bit and somehow hope that it won't be on any particular policy agenda for a little while. But the fact of the matter is that it doesn't solve the problem, right? Effectively, if we don't get ourselves on a more even keel, and as you say, come back to a more affordable basis for property. And by the way, I think that probably means that realizing that property is firstly somewhere to live rather than just an asset class for investment, because that's where we've gone wrong. We've financialized property to the point where people just assume that it's a magic money machine and it just grows, rather than it primarily being somewhere to live. And I think that's where we have to get back to. But that's a really, really uncomfortable message. It's an uncomfortable journey, but I think it's the conversation we probably need to have.
Yeah, I really look forward to 60 Minutes. Hopefully, it's enlightening.
Well, we'll see. You never know, of course, which bit they pick. So, but we ranged wide and far on all these various issues there. Yeah. So it's been really interesting to catch up with you again and to get your point of view, particularly on the Sydney market, and to hear about your own personal property journey. And let's catch up again in a few weeks and see how this plays out, because I think there'll be a few interesting developments in and around the election cycle, right? So I think that's the next thing to watch.
Yeah, I'm actually off shortly to go see the other mild-mannered genius, Michael Mosley. So as I said, you are to property what he is to fasting and health, and you actually kind of look a little bit alike. I don't know.
Well, that's a scary thought. I'm not sure who should be more worried. Anyway, Tony, it's been good to talk to you. I appreciate that, and we'll catch up again soon.
All right. Thanks, Martin.
See ya. Thank you.
Yeah.
So there you have it from Tony. A pretty concerning story, I think, but it does accord rather well with my own perspective in terms of future home price falls. If you like what you've seen here today, please share the post, like the post, add a comment or question. I read them all. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so by ringing that subscribe bell. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.